Hello and welcome to York Observatory's live Teletube broadcast, the online astronomy and astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. We are broadcasting live from the Allan I Carswell Observatory located at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. York YouTube broadcasts every Wednesday night at 7:30 p.m. local Toronto time. For any questions or comments you have of our past shows, or if you have suggestions for future topics, please send us an email at observe@yorku.ca. You can always connect with us on Twitter or Instagram with the handle at York Observatory and Facebook at Allan I Carswell Obs. Good evening, everyone. I'm Maheen, and I'll be one of your hosts this evening along with June, Matt, Sergiy, and Arfa. We are here from the Allan I Carswell Observatory at York University. Tonight, we have a special guest, Rosayla Coulthard, a Co-Op student at the observatory, joining us. Before we get started, I would like to mention that the observatory at York campus is in Toronto, and we would like to welcome you all to our show and to acknowledge the traditional land that our telescope is on. The observatory acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been taken care by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Our stargazing and astronomical efforts join the long history and current practices of astronomy for this land. The observatory looks forward to continuing to learn and revitalizing our knowledge in this area. Next up, June will tell you a bit about what's up in the sky this week.
Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Before we get started with our great talk tonight, I want to give you a little update on what we've got in the sky tonight. And so right now, the great things that we can see with the naked eye are Sirius, Orion, the entire constellation, and the Pleiades, which is one of my favorite open clusters that's on the top of this image right here above Aldebaran. The moon isn't really a big player right now, but Neptune is visible with a telescope, as is Uranus. Speaking of visible with a telescope, Orion definitely lives up to the hype. So we've got a vast number of nebula in that constellation, including the famous Orion Nebula. And the Orion Nebula's glow can actually be seen with the naked eye, even in Toronto. You won't be able to see the detail, but you will be able to see that there is something glowing there.
Thank you, June. So today our guest speaker is Rosayla, who has been an amazing part of the observatory team as a co-op student. You would have noticed her in our earlier episodes, as well as York Observatory tours. She is an 11th grade student and have been researching at the observatory for over 4 months now. She has taken amazing pictures and researched on as Pacman Nebula, also known as NGC 281. And today she will be telling all about it as her research journey. Over to you, Rosayla.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Arfa, and thank you to everyone at the Allan I Carswell Observatory for giving me this incredible opportunity to be a guest speaker on a Teletube, and for this co-op as a whole. I would like to just start off by saying that this Teletube reflects my perspective on my co-op and how this whole experience was for me. So there may be some pictures that are poor quality or some sections that are more story-like. Additionally, this presentation will cover a little bit about what I have learned about NGC 281. To start off, I want to explain what Co-op is for anyone interested in the process. Co-op is a program offered at most high schools that lets you go to a workplace for either half the day or the whole day for that entire semester. About 20% of Co-op takes place in the classroom, where you learn other life skills. The remaining 80% takes place at your placement, which is determined just prior to the school year. At your placements, you will usually be given around the same responsibilities and tasks as those who normally work there. In my case, I had been interested in astronomy for a while, and was very excited to learn that the Allan I Carswell Observatory would be willing to take co-op students. Just as Arfa mentioned, I have been here with the observatory for 4 months, and hopefully for more in the future. The beginning of co-op involved a lot of training and getting connected with the crew. To start off, I had to get added to the email list and other communications for the observatory. From there, I had to learn how to do many of the weekly tasks, including telescope operation, how to take off and put on the telescope covers safely, and how to use the SkyX, MailinCam, and the other programs that we use. Getting started was definitely a very difficult part of this co-op, especially when considering that I knew nothing about astronomy and complex computer software. I would honestly still consider myself very new to all of this, because there is simply that much to learn about astronomy. Now, moving on to some outreaches at the observatory, most of them were online, and for the few that were in person, there were always limits on the number of people there. To start, there is of course observing. Although this is less of an outreach than the others, it's still certainly a large part of what goes on at the Allan I Carswell Observatory. The other 2 in-person outreaches were the atrium events that I have unfortunately not been able to participate in, and the tours. The monthly tours with the occasional in-person observing were definitely one of my favorite outreaches. For the online outreaches, I'm actually participating in one right now. The weekly Teletube is an hour weekly broadcast streamed live to this very YouTube channel. Each Teletube has a host and a few co-hosts who work together to create an interesting and educational video about a new topic. I've been fortunate enough myself to participate in 2 Teletubes up to date, and now this one. There's also the weekly OPV, where the York Universe radio show is streamed live to YouTube. Some of the other outreaches include the calendar creation and special observing sessions. The only special observing session I was able to be there for was when June and Senna were able to find the James Webb Space Telescope and take a few frames. I remember watching the JWST launch around a month ago, so it was very fascinating to see it move through space. The calendar creation was also a very fun outreach, despite how finicky the calendar creation process can be. So a very important part of observing at the Allan I Carswell Observatory is the weather. Prior to my placement, I knew that clouds were an issue to astronomers, but it was not until I was helping out with the observing that I realized just how much of an issue clouds of any kind can be. Often what would happen is students would need to observe exoplanet transitions for one of their courses, and it would be too cloudy. Weeks of clouds can lead to a backup of images that need to be taken. Thankfully, there were enough days for all the students to get their images and for me to get mine in late December. Observing itself also came with many challenges. One that I am sure a lot of observatory staff remember is when the shutter refused to close. Around mid-November, I was closing the dome when the shutter refused to move. What had happened was the shutter had fallen off the tracks that it was on and could not get back on its own. To make things worse, Professor Hyde had already left Petrie, and snow was coming later that night. I was not able to stay there for the shutter fixing, however, it was able to close within the hour. Since then, the shutter has still been having issues and needs to be closed in a special way. Even though everyone tells me that the shutter issue was not my fault, I was the one trying to close the dome, so I still feel as though it was my fault. Another interesting story with the telescopes is when Senna, Professor Hyde, and myself had to recalibrate the 60-centimeter telescope. Recalibrating can be a long process, but what made this one difficult was needing to get the around 12-foot ladder upright in the dome without hitting the 60-centimeter. Once it was upright, we managed to discover that the telescope did in fact not need to be calibrated. Outside of those 2 stories, observing usually ran relatively smoothly. So at the Allan I Carswell Observatory, there are 2 telescopes, the 1-meter and the 60-centimeter. The 1-meter telescope is what is used most often for observations, as the 60-centimeter is being used for projects. It was installed in 2019 where it was lifted through the roof of the dome and placed where the 40-centimeter used to be. The 40-centimeter is now at the atrium and is still used. The 1-meter telescope is shaped differently from most telescopes, as its design allows for it to be super compact. The telescope itself can actually be moved with very little force when the motors are off, because it is in a sense floating on its base using magnets. Though do not try to move it while its motors are on, this will damage the telescope. You must remember this. This is a very important fact about the 1-meter telescope. The 60 centimeter, on the other hand, is much older than the 1 meter and was installed while the observatory was being built. I found that the 60 centimeter is much scarier since it's much larger, heavier, can drive itself into the floor, and is supposedly haunted by the ghost of Carl Sagan. There's also an extra attachment to the 60 called Quail. It is still a work in process, but so far it can take incredible images. A feature of the 60 centimeter dome I found interesting was the writing on the walls of the dome. There are quite a few star coordinates written on the walls, so if anyone is ever there for a tour, keep an eye out for it. So while observing, I have learned many lessons about the telescope, as well as myself actually. So firstly, the most important rule is do not touch the blank. There is a lot of very delicate equipment in both the 60 centimeter and 1 meter dome that is either being worked on or is extremely important. Knowing what you can and cannot touch is the first thing you learn when coming to the observatory. For instance, do not touch Quail. It's very fragile and still a work in progress. Do not touch the mirrors on the 1 meter telescope. That will damage it. On that note, I also learned how to start up and shut down the telescopes, which also come with their own set of do not touch rules. While turning on the 60 centimeter, do not touch the wires or Quail. When turning on the 1 meter, do not touch the mirrors and be very careful when removing the mirror covers. I may be stressing this a lot, however, it is quite easy to remember and definitely very important. On a more lighthearted note, I've also learned how easy it is to fall asleep in the warm room. When observing for hours, the warm room gets very dark and very, warm, and the chairs seem to get extra comfortable as the night goes on. With the issues with the shutter, I also learned how to open and close the domes as well as the shutter. For the 1 meter dome, it is important to turn the dome counterclockwise so that the feet of the dome can connect with the rails to open and close the shutter. I mentioned earlier that I've also learned many personal lessons while observing. The only main one is what it feels like to observe. I'll talk about this more later, but to summarize, observing with these telescopes has helped me strengthen my passion for astronomy. So as I mentioned before, the tours and calendar coding are my favorite outreaches. I'll be discussing the tours in a later section, so right now I will focus on the coding. Now, why this coding was so influential was that it was very much out of my comfort zone. Prior to this co-op, I had very little coding experience, and now despite still having very little experience, I can code graphs and other simple processes. The calendar code project gave me an idea of what coding can accomplish and what I hope to be able to do in the future. Trying to help with the calendar and trying to code my own processes pushed my knowledge to the edge of computers much further. While there were many error messages, there were also some successes, which definitely kept me motivated. The calendar code itself will not be implemented until the 2023 calendar, so this year's calendar still had to be created. For the calendar creation, myself along with the calendar crew were asked to make the calendar for 2022. We needed to choose some images and we thought would look good in the calendar, create a description for them, and finally add in the astronomical events for that month and a few holidays. Looking at all of the images taken at the observatory was a lot of fun, and despite how finicky and annoying at times a calendar could be, it was still very enjoyable to make. But what made the calendar creation for this year incredible was that the calendar was going to contain some of the images that I tagged. Tagging is a process where the raw image is cropped and enlarged to be used by the observatory for a variety of purposes. The logo of the Allan I Carswell Observatory is also added to the image. All of this is done across multiple slides and spreadsheets, and the main portion of the editing is done using GIMP. So far, I've tagged most of the images that the observatory has completed, and hopefully, one day I can tag all the images that remain untagged. Moving on to the Teletube, it is what I am participating in right now. This outreach, along with the OPV, happen twice a week, and each broadcasts are about 1 hour long. The OPV is a YouTube broadcast of the York Universe radio show. It is accompanied by a slide showing some of the images observed here at the Allan I Carswell Observatory. Occasionally, there's a live viewing, and recently I was able to assist with one of these live viewings where we pointed the telescope at Jupiter, the Moon, Neptune, and the Andromeda Galaxy. The weekly Teletubes are hosted by the staff, students, and alumni of York University. Together, hosts and co-hosts will write an interesting and educational video on a topic which is accompanied with a slideshow. On occasion, there will be a guest speaker who will prepare a longer talk about their topic. I am very fortunate to have assisted with 2 teletubes, the Earth Teletube and the recent Astronomikers Teletube. Assisting with both have helped me to write this teletube and understand the whole process. Hopefully I can help with more in the future, as they are definitely very enjoyable. The last outreach I want to talk about is the tours. The Allan I Carswell Observatory has a monthly tour of the domes where anyone can sign up and get a tour and hopefully be able to see some in-person observing. The first tour I assisted with was the December tour, where Jude and myself were giving tours of the 60-centimeter dome. Unfortunately, that night it was too cloudy to do in-person observing, but the tours were a success regardless. The second time I assisted with a tour was the December tour. For this one, I had unfortunately hurt my ankle and was not able to go up and down the stairs as much as I would have liked, so instead I was mainly responsible for selling calendars. Along with the calendar coding, the tours were also another one of my favorite outreaches. The brief period where the last visitor has just left feels very calm and also very rewarding. I also really enjoy the tours because it gives me an opportunity to learn more about the observatory and about everyone who works/volunteers there. The tours are definitely an outreach that I encourage everyone interested in the observatory to try. So now, moving on to the NGC 281 research I was talking about. The process of choosing an object to research was surprisingly one that involved no scientific process. I had originally planned on focusing on one of the star clusters near Cassiopeia. It was a choice between NGC 869 or NGC 7789, both of which are open clusters. Using Stellarium, I was checking for clusters that wouldn't be too low to the horizon or too dim to see with a telescope. While I was checking, I came across the Pacman Nebula, which fulfilled all of the observing criteria and had a unique name. I decided to get a brief summary of all of the objects and found the nebula to be the most interesting. I also figured that it would make a very interesting image. When making observations, the biggest challenge was absolutely the weather. Most days were hazy or had some form of cloud that made observing impossible. When there was favorable weather, the telescope was usually being used for the exoplanet transition observations that were going on. Eventually, there was such a substantial delay in the exoplanet observations that there was a chance that I would not be able to get the images and I would have to use old data. Thankfully, though, the last week before the winter break was clear, and we were able to get all the observations done over 2 days. The imaging process involves getting the right ascension and declination of the object, pointing the dome in the right direction, and finally, taking the images in different filters with different exposure times. For this particular observation, the object was almost directly above the observatory, so around halfway through the night we had to do a meridian flip. This is when the object is too far overhead that the telescope must turn 180 degrees to be able to still point at the object and continue to track it. As a result, the images that came after the meridian flip were slightly shifted to the side. For the first set of images, we were able to get most of the frames. However, at some point during the observing, a haze began to roll in, so we would need to get more images later in the week. We were able to get most of the reds, some infrared, a few blue, and visible light, but no more than that because of the haze. The second night was to get the remaining blue and visible frames. Just like the previous night, a meridian flip needed to be done. This night, all of the frames were able to be collected before the cloud came in. I also want to point out a cool feature of the shot on the slides here. The little line at the bottom is a satellite that ended up photobombing one of our frames, which was very interesting. So once all the images have been taken, the data needed to be reduced. It must go from hundreds of frames to a master red, blue, and visible, along with a few flats and biases. Now, what made reducing the data difficult was the technological resources I had at the time. At the observatory, there was a program that could easily create the master frames and then combine them. However, since I had to do it at home, I needed to use Serial. Serial is very confusing to those with limited astrophotography experience, myself included. I was able to get a master red, blue, and visible light image. When it came to reducing, there was an issue with the images not lining up properly. Thankfully, with the help of those who were there for the observing process, a final product was created. Thank you so much, June and Sana. I would not have been able to do that without your help. This sounds simple, but what I left out was arguably the longest and most difficult part of creating this image: OneDrive. I had forgotten to disable OneDrive before downloading tens of gigabytes of images, causing OneDrive to crash and corrupt all of the images that I had been downloading. The process of downloading images and trying to fix OneDrive repeated a few times until my screen went black and my computer crashed. A few hours later, my screen was still black. This time, however, it was my desktop wallpaper that was making my screen black rather than my computer having issues. This was by far the most difficult part of creating the image, but also definitely the most funny once I discovered the problem. So if anyone watching has OneDrive enabled, please do not reduce data without changing your OneDrive settings. So the image shown here is the final product. This is about 1/9 of the whole Pacman Nebula, and it also covers cluster IC1590, which are the large stars you can see here in the center. So the Pacman Nebula is located 9,200 light years away from the Earth. It's 48 light years across and 1,000 light years above the galactic plane, which is where most of the mass of a galaxy is stored. It was discovered by Edward Barnard in 1883, but not given a common name until recently. The most notable feature of this image is cluster IC1590. This cluster contains 279 blue stars with spectral types between O and B, which help give the nebula its blue color. The cluster is located towards the center of the nebula and adds to the nebula's 7.4 magnitude. The most remarkable feature of the Pacman Nebula is its structure. Beyond its shape resembling that of a popular character, Pacman, it has many more interesting scientific features. Most importantly, the type of nebula. The Pacman Nebula is classified as an H2 emission nebula. These types of nebula range in mass from 100 to 10,000 solar masses, but can have this mass spread from less than 1 light year to hundreds of light years. Their density also varies from millions to singular atoms per square centimeter. Most emission nebula are formed when hydrogen and interstellar gas are ionized by nearby stars. Smaller structures that are visible are dust lanes and bulk globules. Bulk globules are dense and dark, balls of dust, which clump together and are ideal for star formation. If these clumps become large enough in mass, that's when they collapse and form a protostar. Hence why many of these dense regions are responsible for the star formation in nebula. So many of these stars in the nebula often come from these regions, including, so it is believed, cluster IC1590. To begin to wrap up the presentation, I'm going to cover some of my favorite things. I say some because if I were to talk about everything I've enjoyed over the course of this co-op, I would take way too long. Something I definitely want to go over is the image tagging process. The observatory has many untagged images in folders due to how tedious the tagging process can be. Upon being asked to tag a few images, I found that I actually quite liked to tag images. By tagging all the images, I not only got to be helpful, but I also got to look at all the images that were taken. What's truly remarkable about these images is how real they feel. Anyone can look at a Hubble image and think about how nice that looks, but when the images are being slightly distorted because of the atmosphere or when a satellite photobombs your frames, you begin to realize that you're looking at real space objects. In fact, the objects are so far away that you could be seeing light from thousands of years ago. And to me, this was definitely the best part of this co-op. Out of all the images I tagged, the two that I found the most fascinating, of course other than the Pacman Nebula, are the two on screen here, which are the Bubble Nebula and NGC 7331. The Bubble Nebula has some very interesting colors that I can only appreciate more now that I've gone through the whole data reduction process. As for NGC 7331, I really admire the side view of the galaxy. There are also others visible in the background as well as a few different colored stars. Outside of imaging and other space-related activities, I also wanted to talk about another favorite part of this co-op, which is the lessons I have learned. When you learn about theories about how the universe will end or how there are black holes thousands of times larger than the sun, which is hundreds of times larger than the Earth, existential thoughts are very common. I found comfort in thinking about how large the universe really is, because it reminded me to appreciate what I have now, just like this view on screen. This, along with the other lessons about collaboration, how to be a good student, and many others, have what made this co-op such an incredible experience. On that note, what is next for me? Well, I definitely plan on continuing to stay with the observatory, this time just as a volunteer, so hopefully I can still take more images. The opportunities at the Allan I Carswell Observatory are incredible, as are the people here. Hopefully one day I can come to York University and continue to study physics and astronomy here.
Thank you, Rosayla, for walking us through your co-op journey with the observatory. Now I'm gonna take the screen share to words the questions that the hosts have for you. Go ahead, Sergiy.
Thank you, Maheen. Your presentation was very enjoyable, Rosayla. My question for you is, do you have any more plans to code in the future? If yes, then what and why? If no, then why not?
So yes, I absolutely plan to code more in the future. So in the short term, I know I have some computer science classes coming up. So I hope that those will help me progress some of the skills that I have learned at Co-op. And in the long term, I hope that I can use the skills from those classes and what I've learned during this co-op to help with the calendar or perhaps some other projects at the observatory. I know that coding is, well, firstly, a lot of fun, but more importantly, it's an increasingly important skill to have, especially in physics and astronomy. Thank you so much for the question, Sergiy.
Thank you, Rosayla. Now Matt has a question for you.
Thank you, Sergiy. First of all, I wanted to tell you that I loved the presentation. It was really amazing to just see another perspective of what the observatory is for someone else, and I don't know. I appreciate that. Thank you for bringing us that opportunity to hear from someone who's not like a university student or someone that's not used to this kind of things. And I don't know. Well, my question actually is, aside from the nebulae you mentioned, is there any other specific object you would like to observe in the future, and why?
Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much, Matt. I'm very glad to know that hearing another perspective on the observatory has been enjoyable for everyone. So as for your question, this is definitely a really hard one to answer, since with any object I observe, there's definitely something new to learn and something very interesting about the object, especially since I'm, well, definitely a beginner in this field. Overall, though, I'd say that as long as I'm observing something that I can read about and learn more about, I'd very much enjoy it. But if I were to have to pick a specific object, it would definitely have to be any kind of comet. Comet Neowise back in summer of 2020 started my passion for astronomy, so they definitely have a special place in my astronomy heart. And I've also learned very much about comets so far, despite how much I enjoy observing them. But I do know that there is a comet coming by, I believe, sometime in April, May, C 2021-03, I believe, that I definitely love to observe. But as I mentioned, I do not know very much about comets, so I'd still have to look more into that specific comet.
All right, well, that sounds fun. Just remember that anything you don't know yet is just an opportunity to learn something new. So and another thing is that I'm pretty sure that you will be welcome. I'm more than sure that you will be more than welcome to use the telescope at the observatory to do that, to try to look for a comet. And now actually June has another question that he wanted to ask you. Thank you again.
Oh, hey there. Thanks, Matt. So I've of course, I've asked you a lot of questions over the past 4 months because we spend a lot of times in the domes going over how all this stuff works. But one question I do have that I don't think I have gotten an answer yet to is there anything you learned or saw that you didn't expect to learn or see while working here?
That's actually a really good question. I've been thinking about it a lot as my co-op's been coming to an end. And something that I definitely didn't expect to learn while working here is firstly, well, how much there is to learn about astronomy, but secondly, how supportive everyone is of each other. Coming from a high school learning environment, competition is very common and in some cases encouraged. So it was very interesting to come to an environment where everyone is supportive of each other and their achievements. And I found that I was actually able to learn way more than I could in any other environment because of this. And it made me really want to contribute as much as I could. Focusing more on the science side of my learning, I definitely learned that astronomers have very interesting ways of naming objects. There are a multitude of different catalogs and some names that are less serious, such as, well, the Pacman Nebula and, of course, many people's favorite, the Triangulum constellation. So thank you for the question, June.
Thanks for answering it.
All right, I have a question for you now. And it is that, first of all, it was an amazing presentation and I really loved it. And it was really informative at the same time. So my question here is, why did you choose to do this co-op, or what got your attention for this co-op?
Thank you so much for the question, Arfa. So in terms of the program co-op itself, I had been planning on doing it for a while. I knew that it would definitely be a very good experience and make me more of a well-rounded student. But it wasn't really until the summer of 2021 that I had begun to consider where I would actually want to do my placement. It was also around that time I had realized that it is possible to pursue a career in physics and astronomy and to not just have it as a hobby. So I knew I definitely wanted to have a co-op related to astronomy or physics of any kind. But what really drew me to the Allan I Carswell Observatory was the teamwork-oriented projects and research. I had been to York many times before then, and I knew that teamwork and collaboration was really valued here. And I find that this approach to learning is definitely something that I find helps me perform better and to learn more. Thank you so much for the question, Arfa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rosayla, for a very interesting presentation and for everything you've done for the observatory. Well, everyone, you have been listening to the Allan I Carswell Observatory weekly Teletube broadcast, the astronomy and astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. The hosts this evening have been June, Maheen, Arfa, Matt, and myself, Sergiy. Make sure to leave any comments or questions in the comment section of the video and talk to us in the chat right now. We'll be around for the next 20 minutes to answer your questions. All of our programs are free, but if you'd like to make a donation, see our website at observatory.info.yorku.ca. You can always connect with us on Twitter with the handle @YorkObservatory and check out our website for show notes, content updates, and contact info at observatory.info.yorku.ca. Thanks for tuning in, clear skies, and have a good night.